Hi everyone. In this video, we will go through how you can set up a dev environment for building Spark application using SBT and Eclipse. In a previous video, I've already demonstrated how you can use Maven and Eclipse to develop Spark applications. In this video, we'll take a look at how you can use the simple build tool, SBT and Eclipse together. So if you're interested only in the Maven option, have a look at the description of the video for the link to the corresponding video. Now, the steps at a high level to create your dev environment is one, to install the required software. Two, we'll need to build a folder structure that represents the kind of like structure or hierarchy that's expected by SBT, which again, if you're familiar with Maven, it's the exact folder structure. In addition, we'll need to create a few files for our configuration, and then finally we'll run the SBT commands to create the files necessary for Eclipse, and then we'll import the project into an Eclipse workspace, and then we'll run some code. So that's kind of the high-level objective. So going back to the first step, which is about prerequisites and software setup, I've covered all of this in previous videos. Again, you'll find links in the description of the video. If you're not familiar with how to install the software, have a look at some of the video descriptions. Again, the prerequisites are to install Scala, to install SBT, to install Eclipse. You can either install the full-blown Eclipse or just have the Scala IDE, which again is based off of Eclipse. And I'm going to be showing the latter, and assuming you already have an environment with Spark installed. So just again, just since I haven't covered SBT in my previous videos in more detail, I'll just quickly mention only the SBT part. So to install SBT, the simplest approach is just head over to the website scala.sbt.org and just run this command here. That's the simplest if you prefer to use apt-get, or you can of course download and set it up manually. So I'm assuming again that you have all of this set up and configured. You can pause the video and follow my other tutorials, or if you've already crossed that point, let's actually move ahead to step two. So one, we need a folder structure. So for purposes of the demo, I'm going to use the simple app example that's already on the Spark website. So this is really simple to follow. So I'll just use that as an example. So what we need to do is create the required folder structures for that project. So let's go to a terminal. And I'm creating it in my home directory, but feel free to choose a directory of your choice. So here I'll create a folder called simple apps, simple app, and within the simple app I will run a couple of make directory commands. So having run those two commands, if I look at the folder hierarchy, it's actually based off of the Maven folder structure. Again, that's what SBT uses as well. So behind the scene, it's created all this folder structure. So again, using these two make directory commands. So then we'll add two files. So we need to create a build.sbt file. So let's just create the file and we'll add content to it later. So build.sbt, and again in the project folder, so cd project, here we'll create another file that's plugins.sbt. Again, the reason we are creating the folder for or the file for the plugin is primarily to add the Eclipse plugin, but also while we are at it, we'll add another assembly plugin as well. Again, so that's the context. So let's create those two files. Go back to our home folder. And yep, so now we've created the required files. So we have the build.sbt and the plugins. You can use an editor of your choice. I'm just going to use Sublime here and point it to the folder. So just easy to work with. So in our build.sbt, if I go back to this example here. So I'm just going to copy this as is. So really simple. All right, so nothing fancy. All it really does is provide a name for the project, version number. These two would be represented in the build. And then I'm currently using Scala 2.11. If you're using 2.10, of course, you need to update this here. And at minimum, for us to work with the example, we need the org.apache.spark and the Spark core. So again, if you're not familiar with this convention here, so this is a quick hand. It appends the Spark core with the version number. So if you didn't use this and instead you could have written it as 2.11, for example. So instead of doing it this way, it's much more easier to just use this shorthand here. So that's 2% symbol automatically adds the version number. That's a major minor version number at the very end. It's also quite handy because if you're switching between, say, Spark 2.10 and 2.11, you don't have to change all your dependencies. So that's a good practice. So we have created our build.sbt. So before we go ahead and add the plugins, let's actually go to the terminal and run SBT once. So we have created the build.sbt. So now if we run SBT, again, I like to run SBT in interactive mode. So it gives us a lot more control and it's much faster. So let's just go into SBT. Again, depending on how you've run it and the resources or the dependencies, it might take a bit. Again, we haven't progressed very far. All right, so that's a good sign. If you get this prompt, that means the syntax of your build.sbt is correct. As an example, if you missed a character or you've maybe as an example, you've added a comma there by mistake, and you tried running SBT, it'll give you an error. And also keep in mind that anytime you change your SBT and you want to work with that, run a reload. If there are any issues with the syntax here, it'll give you a warning. So again, this was just a demonstration. So let me get rid of that and retry. Okay, so if you get this prompt, that's a good sign. So now that we have added the build.sbt, let's go ahead and add the plugins. So the plugins, again, for purposes of the demo, the main one that we are interested in is the Eclipse one. So if you don't add the plugins, you won't be able to run Eclipse. So if I type Eclipse, you'll notice that it's an invalid import because the plugins haven't been configured yet. So let's go ahead and do that right now. So I'm just, for now, I'm just adding the Eclipse plugin. So here, let's add that Eclipse plugin. So now that we have made the change to the plugin folder, it wouldn't immediately take effect. So again, if I type Eclipse, there's nothing there. So that's because we have to reload. So it's you'll notice now it's loading the Eclipse plugin as well. So hence why we need to run reload. Okay, almost there. So while that's downloading, might as well explain the other plugin that I've got here as well. So again, if you're interested in building an Uber jar, that's quite handy, particularly when you're submitting Spark applications. I always add the SBT Assembly plugin as well. So we'll do that later. Okay, so all good here. So now if I type Eclipse, you'll notice autocomplete is also working. So now behind the scene it's generating all the resource files and the project files necessary for us to import this project into an Eclipse workspace. So let's now run Eclipse as well. So uh, got Eclipse running here. So if this is the first time you're running Eclipse, it'll take a while because it needs to resolve all the dependencies. All right, so it's successfully completed generating the required files for Eclipse. Behind the scene, if you're interested in what's happening, so um, here you'll notice that it's generated a bunch of files, folders. So once you run the Eclipse plugin, it creates the required files, it creates the resource files. And so now that the files have been generated, we can now import the project into Eclipse. So let's hit import. Here we can import an existing project into our workspace, point it to um, the folder where you have installed, I'm sorry, where the application's been created, and hit OK. You'll notice it's picked up the name of the project, which we had originally configured in the build.sbt. Since we have generated the Eclipse files, it picks it up from the config. Right, so it's imported the file, the project really, sorry. So right now we don't have any code, so that's the final step in our project. I'm sorry, in the video here. So far we have done step 1, 2, and 3. So the last stage is let's actually write some code and do something useful. So let's create a new file here. Let's create a new Scala object and let's call this simple app. Simple app, yep, good. And let's go ahead and copy the code from here. That's this bit. Let's copy everything as is. Just waiting for Eclipse to catch up and just paste that there. Ah, missed copying a forward slash. All right, and last thing, we'll update our code so that it points to an actual folder. So where's Spark installed? So it's trying to find the README file in the Spark directory. So cd spark, and here we have the README file. So this is where I've got Spark installed. Your folders maybe obviously will be different. So let me just copy that over. Again, I'm running it in local mode, so this is not pointing to HDFS. All right, so that's pretty much it. The last thing we need to do is set the master. So if you're trying to run it within Eclipse, I'll just show you an error that you will run into, and we'll fix that. So let's run it. And as expected, it'll give you an error that there's no master has not been set. So let's just add it to local. Set master. I'll set it to local and give it a number of cores. Okay, so let's run it again this time. Yeah, save it. And sure enough, it's run successfully, and as expected, it's giving you a count where it's found number of lines with character A and with character B. So that's as expected. So of course, this was a really simple, kind of like a hello world equivalent example of an application that we've created using Eclipse as the IDE, and it's fairly straightforward for us to do so. A few other things worthwhile keeping in mind. So as you may remember, we had to run the SBT Eclipse tool. Now, anytime you don't have to keep running SBT Eclipse when you're changing code, but if you're changing any of your configuration, particularly if you've changed your build.sbt, or if you've changed anything in the project folder, like even the plugins, for example, or anything in the project folder, lib folder, it's a good idea to run SBT Eclipse again. So as an example, let's just say we wanted to add another dependency. So where's my browser? Yep. So let's head over to Maven, and let's actually search for the repo for, say, for example, you are working with Spark SQL, so Spark SQL, and you want to include the dependencies for working with Spark SQL, right? So let's copy this over, and let's add that there. Again, this follows a different syntax. I mean, it's one and the same, but I like to keep things consistent. So let's remove that there. Okay, so now we have added a new dependency. While that's well and good, we need to now update Eclipse with that dependency. So again, you'll remember that anytime you change the build.sbt, if you're in interactive mode, just run reload again. And once it's reloaded again, it's a good sign there's no errors. And now we have to run Eclipse again. Because there's a new dependency that you've added. So Eclipse it's really not aware of these dependencies. So if you look in the reference libraries, you'll not find the Spark SQL added yet. So it'll be added only once you run Eclipse again. So it takes the new dependencies and adds it to the project. But after it's done that, again, Eclipse doesn't, your project, if you have it open, it's not going to automatically pick it up. So we'll need to refresh the project. We'll do that once it's completed creating all the files. Okay, so the additional dependencies have now been added. So what you need to do then is, if you're working with those dependencies, go back to Eclipse and do a refresh. So once you do a refresh, it'll then update the required dependency. So that's something you'll want to keep in mind. The other thing is, of course, you're not always going to use Eclipse to run the Spark application. You'll want to use Spark Submit. So in order to use Spark Submit, we need to generate the jar file. In our example here, so going back to our initial example, we are only using, say, for keeping things simple, let me actually get rid of that. And for our initial example, we are using the Spark core libraries, which of course will be there on a Spark cluster. So nothing really complicated there. So if we were to run this example in Spark, so what we need to do then is package it. So by packaging it, we are putting it into a single jar, our classes. And then let me actually go here. Let's just wait for the jar file to be generated. Again, if it's the first time you're running, it'll take a while. It has to download the required dependencies. Okay, so it's created the jar file here. So for us to run a Spark submit, oops, by mistake I got out of SBT. Let me just go back in. Let me copy that. And for us to run a Spark submit, just got the pseudocode here. Let's just paste that there. All right, so if you want to run Spark submit, it's always helpful to one of the things I forgot is now let me actually go back to Eclipse here. Since I'm running it in Spark submit where I can specify a parameter, I don't want to hard code it. Let me just comment that bit out and let's package it again. So anytime you run package, it'll also compile. If you haven't, if you've made any changes like what I'm doing right now, it'll automatically compile the code before packaging it. Okay, so as you can see, it found one source file was changed, so it's automatically compiling it. Okay, all good there. So let's come back here and let's actually run the Spark submit. All right, so it's kicking off Spark. Okay, so all good. Again, we can see the output and it successfully run that application. All right, so that pretty much concludes this quick video. However, before we wrap up, I'll quickly mention the SBT assembly again, because so far we have a very simple application which does not have a lot of dependencies on non-Spark libraries. However, let's say for instance you're working on a much more complex project, and say for instance you've added dependencies for other big data projects. Let's say for example you have your application utilizes Kafka, so you will have the the Kafka based dependencies, and it starts getting a lot more complicated when you're just working with SBT package. So instead, you'll want to create an Uber jar which packages all the dependencies into one single jar. So in order for us to work with or create an Uber jar, it's helpful to use the other plugin, which is the SBT assembly. So I'm going to add the SBT assembly here. And let's add that. So again, we have changed the build file. So let's reload it. Reload. All right. So now it'll pull the SBT assembly dependencies. Again, you don't have to. Let me just remind you, if it's a simple application like what we're building, again, we don't need the SBT assembly. It's really overkill to create an Uber jar. As a simple SBT package would suffice, but just showing you for more complex examples or how you can use or how you can create an Uber jar. All right, it's now added the required plugin, so now we can actually run SBT assembly. Again, if it's the first time that you're running the SBT assembly, it'll download the required dependencies, but subsequently you'll find it's much faster. Behind the scene uses the same Apache IV to manage dependency. Right, earlier I ran into an error. That's because I didn't set this additional attribute that uh, it's already provided. That basically implies that within our cluster we already have all the required dependencies for Spark Core. So setting it as provided. Once you set it as provided, reload the in SBT run reload, and once you run reload, run assembly again, and this time around it should have successfully um, packaged the library. So again, if we have this jar file here, so we can now go back and where's the sample here? So it shouldn't have changed. It's the same folder. So now you can run the Spark submit again. Again, this example of using the SBT assembly is overkill, given that we don't have any complex dependencies. But as your project increases in complexity and you have a lot more dependencies, it's always a good idea to consider using SBT assembly. So that covers it for this video of developing Spark application using SBT and Eclipse. Hope you liked the video. Thanks for watching.